Marvel actors have a bad habit. They open their mouths in a junket interview, and 5 minutes later the internet has rebuilt an entire plot from one throwaway sentence. Tom Holland has made a career out of this. But this week, it wasn't Holland who slipped. It was the guy playing a guy who shoots people for a living. Jon Bernthal, sitting right next to Holland, casually described a scene from Spider-Man. Brand new day that nobody was supposed to talk about yet. And if you connect it to a rumor that's been floating around since February, it points at one very specific, very beloved character walking back into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Let's get into it. So first, some setup because this matters for anyone who hasn't been tracking the Bernthal timeline. Frank Castle, the Punisher, first showed up in live action back in Daredevil Season 2 on Netflix in 2016. He was supposed to be a one-off villain for that season. Instead, he became popular enough to get his own spin-off series. When Disney bought back the rights to those Netflix Marvel shows, fans assumed the character was gone for good, tied up in streaming limbo forever. Then Marvel Studios did something nobody predicted. They folded Frank Castle directly into the mainline MCU timeline through Daredevil. Born Again, treating the Netflix era as canon instead of pretending it never happened. Now Bernthal is showing up in a Spider-Man movie, playing the exact same character, no reboot, no recast. That alone is a pretty big signal about how Marvel is treating its old Netflix corner of the universe. They're not burying it, they're building on it. Which brings us to this week's interview. Bernthal and Holland sat down with Nuvi to promote a completely different movie, a survival drama called The Odyssey that the two of them star in together. The Spider-Man questions were basically an afterthought, tacked on at the end. And that's exactly the kind of setting where actors let their guard down because they think the cameras are only half paying attention. The question that started it all was simple. The interviewer asked which is harder to fake on camera, laughing convincingly or waking up convincingly. Holland answered first and said laughing is brutal because it's nearly impossible to force a real one on command. Then it was Bernthal's turn. And instead of giving a clean answer, he went somewhere specific. He said he genuinely hates faking a wake-up on camera, and then, almost as an aside, he mentioned he'd just come from an ADR session. For anyone who doesn't know the term, ADR stands for Automated Dialogue Replacement. It's the process where actors go back into a studio months after filming wraps to re-record lines that didn't come out clean on set, whether that's because of background noise, a mumbled word, or a director wanting a different read. Actors doing ADR are, by definition, working on scenes from the final cut of the movie. So whatever Bernthal describes next isn't a deleted scene or something that got cut in editing. It's in the movie. And here's what he described. He said he had just finished redoing his lines for a scene where his character wakes up in a hospital, with Peter Parker also in that hospital. He joked that his own performance of waking up looked unconvincing, calling it rough, and said he wasn't sure the take worked. Holland immediately jumped in to defend him, saying he'd already watched the finished film and thought Bernthal's take was genuinely great. Now, on the surface, this sounds like nothing. Two actors ribbing each other about acting technique. But strip away the joke and look at the actual information buried inside it. We now know, straight from the people who made the film, that there is a hospital scene in Spider-Man. Brand New Day. We know both Frank Castle and Peter Parker are present in that scene. And we know at least one of them is being treated for an injury because someone in that room is waking up from something. Here's where it gets interesting and where different outlets are actually reading the moment differently, which is worth pointing out because most coverage online is treating this as settled fact when it isn't. Some reporting frames it as Frank Castle being the one who's hurt, waking up to find Peter watching over him. Other coverage reads Bernthal's comment the opposite way, with Frank as the one keeping watch while Peter is the patient. Bernthal's own phrasing was casual and a little jumbled, which is honestly how most people talk in real interviews. So it's genuinely ambiguous which one of them is lying in that hospital bed. What isn't ambiguous is that a hospital scene exists, both characters are in it, and it made the final cut of the movie. So why does a hospital scene matter enough for an entire news cycle to form around it? Because of a name that's been circulating in Spider-Man rumor circles since earlier this year. Rosario Dawson's Claire Temple. If you didn't spend the 2010s deep in Marvel Netflix content, here's the quick version. Claire Temple was introduced as a nurse in the very first season of Daredevil, treating Matt Murdock's injuries after his nightly rooftop beatings without asking too many questions. She became the connective tissue of that entire Netflix corner of Marvel. She patched up Luke Cage. She crossed paths with Jessica Jones. She showed up in Iron Fist. She was there for the Defenders. Fans nicknamed her the Night Nurse, a nod to a much older Marvel Comics character who performs a similar role, quietly treating superheroes who can't exactly walk into a regular emergency room and explain their injuries. Claire's entire narrative purpose across 5 different shows was patching up heroes who couldn't go through normal channels. A hospital scene involving an injured vigilante is, structurally, exactly the kind of scene she was built for. Back in February, industry insider Daniel Richtman, who had a long track record with Marvel scoops, reported that Dawson would be returning as Claire Temple in Brand New Day. According to that report, Peter's injuries in the film are severe enough that Frank Castle personally carries him to Claire for treatment. If that's accurate, it's not just a random plot beat. It's a direct live-action recreation of one of the most iconic images from Marvel's Civil War comic run, where Punisher is drawn, cradling a badly beaten Spider-Man and shouting for someone to help him. That's a deep-cut comic reference, and it would be a pretty clever way for the film to honor decades of comic history, while also justifying why these two very different characters end up in a hospital together in the first place. Put those two pieces side by side. A months-old insider report claiming Claire Temple treats an injured Spider-Man after the Punisher brings him in. And now, straight from Bernthal's own mouth, confirmation that a hospital scene with both characters exists in the finished film. The pieces line up almost too neatly. Neither piece proves the other on its own, but together they build a much stronger case than either rumor had by itself. That said, let's not skip the skeptical read, because a responsible take on any leak has to include it. Nothing Bernthal said actually names Claire Temple. He never mentioned her, never mentioned Rosario Dawson, never mentioned a nurse at all. He described a hospital and 2 guys, one of them waking up. That's it. It's entirely possible this is a background extra playing a random doctor with zero connection to any previous Marvel property. It's also worth remembering Peter Parker has a pretty specific identity problem in this era of the MCU, since the entire world was made to forget he exists after the spell in No Way Home. Walking into a normal hospital and getting treated under his real name should be logistically complicated for him, which is actually a decent argument for why the film would need someone outside the normal system, like Claire, to handle it quietly. On the other hand, this universe also has Bruce Banner sitting right there in the cast list, and a scientist with a medical degree and a habit of turning green under stress is a perfectly reasonable alternative explanation for who's treating a badly hurt hero off the books. There's also a timing argument worth considering. Some corners of the fan community think Marvel might be saving Claire's official MCU return for something bigger down the line, specifically a rumored Defenders reunion story tied to a future season of Daredevil, Born Again. Under that theory, a quick Spider-Man cameo would actually undercut a much larger, more emotional homecoming later. Marvel has historically liked to make first appearances count for something, so there's a real argument that they'd hold Claire back rather than spin her on a 2-minute hospital scene in someone else's movie. Still, weigh the evidence as a whole. We have a specific insider report from February describing this exact scenario in detail, months before Bernthal ever opened his mouth about it. We have Bernthal independently confirming a hospital scene with Frank and Peter both present, straight from ADR on the finished cut. We have a comic book panel from Civil War that maps almost perfectly onto the scenario being described. That's 3 separate threads converging on the same idea, without any of them clearly copying off the others. It's not a lock confirmation, but it's about as strong as pre-release scoops get before an actual trailer drops. Zooming out for a second, this whole situation says something bigger about where Marvel Studios is heading creatively. For years after buying back the Netflix shows, Marvel treated them like they didn't exist. No references, no cameos, nothing. That changed hard with Daredevil, Born Again, which folded Kingpin, Foggy Nelson, and Frank Castle straight into the main timeline like they'd been there all along. Now that same strategy appears to be leaking into the Spider-Man franchise itself, one of the biggest, most mainstream corners of the entire MCU. If Claire Temple genuinely shows up in Brand New Day, it's a strong signal that Marvel plans to keep mining that entire Netflix well for years to come, instead of treating it as a walled-off experiment from a different era of the company. Spider-Man. Brand New Day hits theaters on July 31st, 2026, directed by Destin Daniel Cretton, with Tom Holland back in the suit alongside Bernthal, Zendaya, Mark Ruffalo, Jacob Batalon, and a cast that keeps expanding every time Marvel drops a new casting. Update. Whether that hospital bed belongs to Frank Castle, Peter Parker, or honestly turns out to be neither one of them in the way we're assuming, we won't know for certain until the movie itself answers it. So here's the actual question worth sitting with. If Claire Temple does walk back into the MCU through a Spider-Man movie of all places, does that cheapen a character who spent 5 seasons being the emotional backbone of Marvel's grittiest corner of television? Or is this exactly the kind of full-circle payoff that makes a shared universe worth following in the first place? Drop your take in the comments. And if you want the next update, the second an actual trailer confirms or kills this theory, you know what to do. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.